Wanna learn about the brain? Come and join us as we tackle the function and parts of the brain. Even though the brain looks like a 1.4 kilogram of pinkish-gray walnut, the brain is made up of superspecific areas that have superspecific functions. You'll remember that our nervous system is divided into two main networks that work in harmony. The central nervous system consisting of your amazing brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system made up of the nerves coming out of that central nervous system. The central nervous system main game is integrating the sensory information that the peripheral system collects from all over the body, and responding to it by coordinating both conscious and unconscious activity. For example, I'm hungry, so I'll get some food, the phone is ringing, maybe I'll answer it. All these sensations, thoughts and directions process through this two-part system. It is the brain, of course, that sorts out all that sensory information and gives orders. It also carries out your most complex functions like thinking, and feeling, and remembering. The brain is made of a fragile, jelly-like nervous tissue that is extremely susceptible to injury. So all that goo is well protected by the bones of your vertebrae and cranium, as well as membrane layers, or meninges, before being bathed in a cushy waterbed of clear cerebrospinal fluid. This fluid actually allows your brain to float somewhat in your skull, reducing its weight and letting it slosh around while you and your head are free to move. But still, even with all of these extra protection, your brain is still vulnerable, and IRS vulnerabilities can be incredibly specific. Because your brain is divided into specialized regions that may, or may not, interact with each other to produce a given action. We can better understand this division of labor by looking at how the brain first develops into its main components part. Inside a developing embryo, the central nervous system starts off as a humble little neural tube. Soon the caudal, or the lower end of the tube, stretches out, forming the spinal cord, while the cranial end begins to expand, divide, and enlarge into three primary brain vesicles, or interconnected chambers. This is like your protobrain. We call these chambers the prosencephalon, the mesencephalon, and the rhombencephalon or forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. By an embryo's 5th week of development, these main three chambers start morphing into 5 secondary vesicles that essentially form the roots of what will become your grown-up brain structures. The prosencephalon divides into 2 sections, the telencephalon and diencephalon. The rhombencephalon forms into another pair, called metencephalon, and the myelencephalon. And in between, the mesencephalon, thanks to evolution, remains undivided. The real action starts as these 5 secondary vesicles start developing into the major adult brain regions that you might be more familiar with: the brainstem, the cerebellum, the diencephalon, also known as the interbrain, and finally the cerebral hemispheres. But in order to go from a simple tube into that classic, wrinkly icon we think of as the brain, each of these 5 vesicles grows in different ways. Basically, some develop a lot more than others. The least dramatic changes occur in the 3 most caudal or lower sections, the mesencephalon, the metencephalon, and the myelencephalon. They go on to form the cerebellum, which mostly helps coordinate muscular activity, and the brainstem, which plays a vital role in relaying information between the body and the higher regions of the brain. The brainstem actually has 3 main components. You have the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. Together they regulate many of the most basic, vital involuntary functions, like keeping your heart on pace, keeping your lungs working, and controlling things like sleep appetite, and pain sensitivity, and awareness. But of the 3 brainstem parts, it's your midbrain that carries out higher-level function. Like when your eyes track a fast-moving object, it's the midbrain that receives and processes that sensory information and sends out the reflexive motor signals, so you react without thinking. The midbrain also passes the data to regions like the cerebral cortex, which do the actual conscious thinking about the stimuli. So with the brainstem and cerebellum covering your basic life and motor functions, you start to see somewhat more complex tasks being carried out in the next major brain structures, the diencephalon. This is where you find the thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus, and the mammillary bodies, which regulate things like homeostasis, alertness, and reproductive activity. Here we also find part of the limbic system, which is a center for strong emotions, like fear. This area is sometimes called the reptilian brain, because we share it with some of our less philosophical animal brethren like lizards and fish, as they don't think so much and focus on the more instinctual pursuits that are ruled by the casual regions of the brain like eat, drink, sleep, mate, and stay safe. All these things are awesome, but it wasn't until the appearance of birds and mammals that some animals' brains came to be dominated by the last of the 5 vesicles, the telencephalon. During your brain's growth, the telencephalon undergoes the biggest changes of all, as it develops into the most brainy part of your brain, the two classic, walnut-looking hemispheres we collectively call the cerebrum, that cover the rest of your brain like a mushroom cap on its stalk. That's the cerebrum, and it is the largest region of the brain and performs the highest functions. It's made up of the wrinkled, outer layer of gray matter called the cerebral cortex, and the inner squishy layer of white matter beneath it. And it's the cerebrum that rules our voluntary movements and our most advanced tricks, like thinking, learning, regulating, recognizing emotions, and experiencing consciousness in general. You'll remember that higher processing requires a lot of synapses, which requires lots of nervous tissue. So as the cerebrum grew through evolutionary time, it got more massive, but our skull didn't exactly keep up. So in order to squeeze all that material into your skull, the brain forms little creases, called gyri, and larger grooves, or sulci, giving it more folds than an origami pineapple. And although a big fissure separates the left and right hemispheres, the two halves communicate through a series of myelinated axon fibers called the corpus callosum, and each hemisphere has other, smaller fissures that divided it into lobes, each with a different set of major functions. The frontal lobe, for example, governs muscle control and cognitive function like planning for the future, concentration, and preventing socially unacceptable behaviors. In most people, this area doesn't finish developing until after the teenage years. Since Broca's area lives in this lobe in the left hemisphere, it also is important in language comprehension and speech. If you're enjoying a beautiful sunset, you can thank your occipital lobe at the back of your head for processing those bright visual cues. And the next time you step on a Lego, you can curse your parietal lobe, which processes the sensation of touch, pain, and pressure. Meanwhile, the temporal lobe helps sort out auditory information, including language. It contains Wernicke's area, another important region of the brain associated with the production of written and spoken language. This part of the limbic system includes your short-term memory keeper, hippocampus, and the emotional amygdala, which controls sexual and social behavior. So if you damage the wrong part of your temporal lobe, you may never again be able to remember what you ate for lunch, or you might suddenly become a total crazy person. And you have to remember that, when it comes to your body, no organ or system is an island. Your brain would be pretty useless if it weren't hooked up to the outside world. Meanwhile, you learned today how important location is to brain function. We looked at how the brain develops from an unassuming neural tube into 3 primary vesicles and 5 secondary vesicles, and finally into our complex sets of 4 adult structures and their basic function. Thank you all for listening and watching.